As we saw in the last segment, tensors can be used in diffusion imaging. Unfortunately, tensors have limitations which can cause misrepresentation of neural structure. For example, axons oriented in one direction will correctly result in an elongated tensor along the axon direction. And axons oriented in another direction also correctly result in an elongated and properly oriented tensor. However, some voxels contain axon crossings, where fibers are oriented in two directions. The resultant tensor of voxels with fiber crossings is disc-shaped, and neither axon presence nor orientation can be determined. The disc shape is caused by two factors. First, as portrayed in this simplified example, we only measure diffusivity in 6 gradient directions, or points in Q space, and consequently we can't be certain of diffusion in other directions. Second, even if we had measured more points, the tensor can never form a shape representative of fiber crossings through its 6 degrees of freedom. Instead it is limited to variously oriented disc, cigar, and sphere shapes. Together these factors display the Gaussian assumption present in diffusion tensors, that the diffusion shape is smooth between our sparse measured points. HARDI, a technique that involves measuring many points in Q space, distributed in a sphere shape, is often used to obtain a more thorough view of diffusion in a voxel. Appropriately, the largest diffusivity values are along the directions of the axons in our example fiber crossing voxel. HARDI data is often not converted to diffusivity values through the Stejskal-Tanner equation, but left as the raw signal value remaining after the diffusion gradients. Remember, because diffusion along the gradient direction leads to signal loss, these signal values are smaller along directions with greater amounts of diffusion. This results in larger signal values opposite to axon orientations. A Funk-Radon transform is often employed on HARDI-derived data to form a diffusion shape called a cue-ball. The Funk-Radon transform essentially sets each point on a cue-ball proportional to all of the signal values equatorial to that point. For example, the north pole of a cue-ball is proportional to the sum of signal values along the equator in Q space. Any point on the cue ball can be determined by treating it as a pole and scaling it proportional to the relative equator. By performing this process on all points, the Funk-Radon transform fills out the cue ball shape. There are several things to keep in mind when creating diffusion shapes in this manner. For example, because each point on the cue ball is determined through many signal measurements, the overall shape is fairly resilient to noise. However, this same feature causes the cue ball to be artificially smooth and inflated, a concern we will later detail. Most importantly, unlike the tensor, the cue ball can form shapes which properly represent the presence and orientation of crossing fiber tracks. This concludes our segment on HARDI and cue ball diffusion data. Next we will cover additional processing techniques to further refine diffusion imaging results.